So John, it always strikes me in my travels where you encounter John Wesley Powell. So for example, when I'm in Washington, D.C., I go to the Cosmos Club, there's his image. You go to the Grand Canyon, and his image and his name are really everywhere. Mormon communities and places like Green River, Utah, there's a strong presence. And I also know he had a very strong presence in the Bureau of Ethnology in preserving American Indian cultures. So it strikes me, going back to the story of the voyage, this individual has an ability to really interact with a lot of different groups of people, and you see that reflected in his legacy. So people like the mountain man that had his beard burned off,
yeah.
Soldiers at Shiloh, Ute Indians, Mormons, all the people he encountered on this trip. So he really had to have an extraordinary background that gave him that ability to interact with so many different groups of people.
Jeremy, this was one of the real questions I wanted to answer in this book, because it was really I was wondering about, this visionary business, but it was also his ability, as you say, to really feel, empathy is strong, but to really think about and value very, very different perspectives. We kind of take a lot of that for granted today, but back in the day, back in the 19th century, Indians and Mormons were, by a large European white community, not really valued at all, to be frank. So where did that come? So I started peeling back the onion on that, and I found some really interesting anecdotes of where he was growing up. And his father was a recent immigrant with his wife from England. They were Methodist ministers, and they ended up down in southern Ohio, very close to the Ohio River, which was, as you know, is the border, the bright line between slave state and the free state. So there, this was the place where in the 1830s, the Underground Railroad was developing. There were escaped slaves who came over, and Ohio didn't recognize slavery, but they also recognized that Kentucky had the right of property and slaves were right. So it was a very complicated, violent world. And in stepped this young family, and as Powell was a boy, and Powell's father got radicalized, became an abolitionist. When abolitionists, Emerson called them a lot of bad names. They were very frightening. They were radicals, really, in a very, very, in a tough way. So much to the extent that young Powell, I found, was stoned out of the school by his schoolmates for what his father believed, and hurt pretty badly from what I can gather. So he was pulled out of that school. He couldn't go back, and he was put with a friend of the family's, who was this George Crookham, who was a great 400-pound man who was a self-taught Samuel Johnston of the woods. He was an incredibly erudite, interesting natural history guy and all like that. And that's really where Powell got started on a lot of his interest in this world of geology and natural history and fossils and the things that they were finding. But that experience of him being kind of cast out of the community there and watching his father standing up for his beliefs, I think really made him very, very sensitive to being an outsider and seeing different communities and seeing and being interested in them in different ways. So during the Civil War, he was, for a short time, he was head of a colored regiment, very unusual, and later with the Indians, as we were talking about, especially in the Southwest, some of the last contacted Indians in terms of a lot of white Indian interactions. When the Mormons came in and brought their livestock, and it really upset a lot of the traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyles of the Indians. There were a lot of tensions and all like that. And he came in and he had started to collect some of their, and continue to do that, some of their material artifacts, but pretty soon the way he thought about things more systematically. He started putting together really the first major systematic approach to thinking and studying native cultures, I think possibly in the world, on their languages. And so he spoke Ute, learned that, and he started looking into a lot of their cultural practices and things like that. He started becoming an immersive anthropologist, which meant he went into some, this was just beginning to happen, he went down into a Hopi, did a 24-hour ceremony where he was part of it, took off all his clothes, did everything part of all of that, and started writing about it, but really began to, and Powell would go on at the Bureau of Ethnology, begin to really promote anthropologists and promote the intersection of anthropologists and geologists. And of course this had started in the Enlightenment, but really in Washington D.C. with the advent of and he was a very much a proponent of federal science. He's founded the Cosmos Club for the increase and diffusion of ideas, to borrow from the Smithsonian. But he also was a founding member of the National Geographic Society. He would have his door open in Washington D.C. and if you came by one day in the afternoon, you would find somebody that had just come back from the American West with some fossil, toothed birds, and you'd find someone who was working on some interesting ideas on progressive philosophy, and you'd find, a geologist hanging around. And what Powell was really wonderful about, he was really, really interested in how all these connected and putting people together. And he created this whole kind of, and stretched things a little bit on federal science. His USGS and was really supporting a lot of scientists in, paleontology and paleobotany and all of these things, that don't necessarily seem to have, some really, as the Congress wanted the USGS to be kind of exclusively devoted to, finding mineral resources. And so the first director had been told of the USGS, your job is to find, mineral resources, pretty much in terms of a very economic, and Powell just really elbowed around the edges and created this great scientific establishment, which of course would, ultimately pay off in itself in so many different ways, but that weren't necessarily apparent, to a congressman looking at an appropriations budget, and looking at trying to balance the books. Here was Powell always talking about the big picture. Wow. Let's map the entire United States. And it was such a huge project that it would not be finished until the latter part of the 20th century. He had that kind of vision to think big and to press people to think bigger and more responsibly, about the world around them.
Yeah, that's a tremendous legacy.
Yeah, it really is. And it, as you say, it really does kind of pervade so many things. The U.S. Geological Survey still has so much of, what he imparted to it with, their maps and the way they go about thinking about their job and their role. And then you come out and the American West is filled with, the Powell's legacy in very interesting, odd corners. But still, it just astounds me. And it did bring an earlier historian to say that Powell's effect was greater than a lot of presidents, U.S. American presidents, because of just it was in so many different worlds, pushing so many different things, bringing up so many ideas, setting up so many institutions,